Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support this broadcast. The best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, $5 or more a month, $50 or more a year. The sky's the limit, so you can become a founding member at $150 or more. And for members only, we do private weekly Zoom chats where we just shoot the breeze on current events. We also bring back past podcast guests to do live sessions with them for members only. And I do a weekly commentary where I compile the news for members only as well. You could also donate to keep me on the airwaves. You can do that through Buy Me a Coffee, Donor Box, Wise, and so forth. And you can also purchase a consult with me if you just want to chat about expatriating, geopolitics, whatever you like. And our sponsor this month is Mikkel Thorup's Expat Money Summit. It's going to be taking place October 7th to the 11th online, entirely for free. You just need to sign up. The link is in the description, expatmoneysummit.com. So you do have to reserve your free ticket. They also have a VIP option. And if you use the promo code EMPIRE, you'll get $100 off. And basically, during the summit, I watch it every year. They'll be talking about internationalizing, investing in offshore real estate, getting multiple passports or residencies, that sort of stuff. I'm pretty good on that. I've got 3 passports, and a lot of the headline speakers have been on the Geopolitics and Empire podcast, such as Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, Tom Woods, Mark Faber, and Tom Luongo. And there will also be VIP panels. Those won't be free. I'll be participating in one of them, but it's a lot of fun. I watch it every year. I find it very useful. So do check it out. Link is in the description. And do check out my affiliates as well. Legal Shield, Wise Wolf Gold, Above Phone, EasyDNS.com. If you use the coupon code Geopolitics, you get 15% off there. And do leave a podcast review. Joining us for the first time is David Haggith. He writes at thedailydoom.com, covering the economy, politics, geopolitics, wars and rumors of wars, the march of tyranny, and more. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, David.
Thank you, Herboya. Glad to be on.
So, I've known about your work for many, many years. Actually, it's kind of funny, and we finally connected. And just briefly, if you want to tell the audience about the work that you've been doing over the years at Daily Doom, and I know your stuff gets published elsewhere.
Well, originally I had my own website called thegreatrecession.info, and that's when I got started writing. Was when the Great Recession started, and I wrote all about the economic stuff, the bailouts, ridiculous stuff the Fed was doing, the crash courses that we were on, and all of that. And then that kind of morphed into writing a little bit more broadly about some geopolitics as well, but still focusing mostly on the big economic picture. And I do that at thedailydoom.com. The other website's gone now, so I just focus on thedailydoom.com, where I write an editorial every weekday, and 4 days out of the week. And then on the 5th day, I write a special article that digs in deeper for my paying subscribers. The others are free for everyone. And then I post news headlines as well that relate to the kind of stuff I'm writing about. Basically, I go through, look at what's in the news, pick out what I think is the most important story or interesting to me, and write about that.
Yeah, that's very cool. I do something like that, so we overlap a bit. And your website is on Substack, so people can, again, easily become a free subscriber or become a paid subscriber of yours on Substack. The link is in the description. Again, so I thought maybe to get your big picture take on what's happening in the world, and starting with the economy, I guess, and looking at some of your recent articles, they're interesting. Like this one, it is paywall, but it says de-dollarization isn't all it's cracked up to be. And of course, there are multiple issues: inflation, the status of the dollar, the stock market, and so forth. So maybe just starting from the 30,000-foot view and then drilling on down. How do you see the state of the economy?
Okay, so this year, every year I make predictions of what I think is going to happen in the year. And the reason I do that is I think there's some pretty predictable cause and effect in the kinds of things that the Federal Reserve does and that our politicians do to us as well. And so I like to predict in advance where I think these things are going to go so that people can see that the cause and effect is basically predictable, right? So or I'm looking at trends and seeing where I think they will go. So last year, when everybody thought the Fed was winning on inflation, I started saying in the middle of last summer that actually inflation was going up behind the scenes, and that would push through and would appear early this year. And the Fed would be back in the inflation fight, and therefore it would have to tighten a whole lot longer than people believed it would. And that's exactly what we saw. Everybody in the market was casting their bets on, the Fed will start cutting rates in March. Of course, they've been casting their bets that the Fed was going to pivot for well over a year, and I've been saying that's not going to happen. This inflation fight is a big deal. It's a big deal to the Fed, and it's a lot harder to put down than what a lot of people think. So I've been saying for already a year the Fed wasn't going to pivot. And when we got to January, I said it's not going to happen in March when everybody thinks it is. In fact, if anything, the Fed's going to have to actually raise rates then. I said they won't do it. They don't have the courage to do it. But they will find themselves in an inflation situation where if they really want to knock inflation down, that's what they would need to do. And so that's what we found was the first part of the year, inflation rose during those first 3 months. And by March, there was no way the Fed was going to cut rates. Everybody switched their bets to June. I said that wasn't going to happen either for the same reasons. But that inflation was taking a bit of a rest. And then I've said it's going to probably pick back up here again at the end of the summertime because there's a lot of underlying inflation pressures that don't show up right away in CPI. Housing costs take over a year to price into CPI. Well, we've had an entire year of rising housing costs all over the United States. And so those are most likely going to price through. That's what they do. We've got producer prices that have been going up for the last couple of months. Those are just, a short distance up the pipeline before they come down and hit consumers. But when producers start increasing their prices to retailers, then retailers are going to increase prices to consumers. And then we've got oil, which I said is going to go back up in March. It hasn't gone up as much as I thought, but it's obviously facing pressure. And that gets factored into everything. So I think there's a chance that inflation will rise again. I've been saying end of March or September, maybe just in time for the Fed's meeting. So will the Fed cut in September? I don't know. It will. I think they've been telegraphing they will if inflation keeps its head down all the way through their meeting. Doesn't mean it won't come back up the next month and they'll wish they hadn't. So I think they're battling, still an inflation fight. And my big statement has been they're going for the last 3 years has been that what's going to happen is the Fed's going to have to fight inflation so long and hard that we're going to wind up being in a recession before the Fed can even stop the battle of inflation. So we're going to still be fighting it as we go into a recession. And my claim for this year has been we're in a recession. We're in a stealth recession. It's not showing up in GDP, but it's showing up in metrics all over the place. I don't know if you're familiar with Daniel DiMartino Booth, but she just did an interview with Adam Taggart, and she said the same thing. We're already in a recession. And I had been saying for a year, this recession is not going to show up to the Fed because our labor metrics are broken because of the lockdowns that we did during the COVID period. And those metrics are broken down badly enough that the Fed isn't going to be able to see unemployment rising when it needs to in order to say, okay, we got to start cutting here because unemployment's going up, so we got to start cutting rates. They're not going to get that signal in time. So they're going to find themselves tightening into it all the way into a recession and well into it. And I think they're already doing that because I agree with Daniel DiMartino Booth that we're already in a recession. It shows up in other labor metrics if you don't use the government's metrics. And she went back through and, she does a lot of research on this kind of stuff and, looked at other labor metrics that show, oh my gosh, the labor market is just caving in. So, the government's metrics, I think, are, I don't want to quite say rigged, but let's just say when you're doing seasonal adjustments and you work for an administration that wants to win as badly as this one does because they want to make sure to keep Trump out. And, everybody always wants to win their election anyway. So we're in an election year. I think there's room in all of those massaging of the numbers for, seasonal adjustments to kind of do some goal seeking and get them where you want them. And what we see is every time the numbers for unemployment as well as other things come out better at first, and then the next month they get revised to worse. And it's always they get revised to worse. Well, that tells me they're intentionally coming out with the best number they possibly can. And then when nobody's looking the next month or the next quarter, they adjust it down to reality because nobody cares then. We're all looking at the new month, So I think we got badly broken metrics.
Yeah. And before moving on to the issue of the dollar, just on inflation, I want to ask you the way sort of I look at this is, yeah, a lot of this is a consequence, a natural consequence of the central bank and all that sort of stuff. But I also sort of look at it as a part of this great reset type project. This global oligarchy that we have, the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, all that sort of stuff. And it seems like one thing that, maybe it's part intentional and part unintentional, but this wiping out of the middle class, right? This neo-feudalism where they want to just, erase the middle class and basically have us as the serfs or plebes, like, in movie Matt Damon's Elysium or something like that. And then it's to them, the aristocracy. And so inflation, I see, is one way that they're doing that. And I see this all across the board. I'm living down here in Mexico. I'm an American who expatriated here, and there's housing, there's all sorts of things. I was reading in Canada now, Canadians are paying more tax now than housing, food, and clothing combined. And I'm seeing here in Mexico, in the U.S., in Europe, people can't afford homes, and so it's just the middle class is being inflated away, eroded away. Any thoughts on sort of this moving towards a type of a neo-feudalism?
Yeah, well, I think very definitely so. I mean, you look at any graph that shows which part of the population has been benefiting from the Federal Reserve and all of its bailouts and all of its money printing for the last 20 years. And it's obviously clear that the top 1% have benefited astronomically, and that the people in the middle have at best held flat, and the poor people have gotten poorer. It doesn't trickle down. So like when Janet Yellen was head of the Federal Reserve, and she said, well, we're really concerned about income inequality and why our plans aren't leading to better income equality. Well, how can they? They give all the money directly to the richest bankers, and they pump it into the banks and into the stock market. So of course the money is going to enrich people. And the idea that it will trickle down, it doesn't trickle down. The filters are far too fine to allow much to trickle, and so very little trickles down. It stays up, it gets regenerated, and asset purchases and sales by those who have the money to do that. Most of us don't have the money to play in any serious way in that market because the risks are too big. It's a casino. If the stock market were a place where you just bought interest in a company and you could write it out for its profits, that would be fine. But everybody's gaming it, and so depending on how the gaming's going, you can buy what you think is a good company and still have it go down because someone finds a way to flush it. And it's like, a lot of us just don't have the money to play in that game. So yeah, I think the Federal Reserve has done that. And I think the US government does it. And a way they do it is, one way they do it is with immigration policy. They will take and deliver, Republican or Democrat, it doesn't make any difference. Maybe under Trump, there's some difference, but typically under Republicans or Democrats, they're both willing to make immigration illegal. And then they're both willing to turn a blind eye to it because, and this is the part that I think is interesting, how do you create a peasant class? Well, the United States likes to offshore its jobs. We've seen that for a couple of decades, to find cheaper labor for the rich people here so they can make more money. It doesn't help the rest of us, doesn't create jobs here as Reagan had promised it would. Instead, the money they're making in stocks goes to building factories in China, and they make, or wherever, and they make their money there. So you can offshore those jobs and save yourself money and get even richer. But you can't offshore jobs like housekeeping, working in a restaurant, tending lawns. They have to, hotel work. They have to be done here. So what do? You create a peasant class. You find people that would like to come here, but you make their coming here illegal. So they have to keep their heads low. But then you turn a blind eye to the fact that they're coming and let 1 million or 2 million of them in anyway, but they're all illegal. So they all have to keep their heads low. They're a non-landed people. They own no land. They have no rights to vote. So they're true peasants. They don't have citizens' rights, and I think that's the biggest reason immigration policy works as it does in the United States, is to create a constant pool of 1 million or 2 million peasants that will come into the country because that's where they're going to be held.
That is a fantastic analysis. I've never heard it crystallized as you have right now. It's like a double whammy. It's like a double offshore, where they offshore and then they bring this in to sort of
they inshore the offshoring, right?
And that way they sort of lock in this dystopian the
Yeah.
peasant class system. So genius. They are genius. And what about the dollar then? I've had on a lot of folks on the podcast over the many years, Jim Rogers, Peter Schiff, Mark Faber, and some of them are like, the dollar is going to hyperinflate and it's going to crash. And look, this isn't my forte, the finance and economics, which is why I bring people like yourself on and I hear different views. And I'm on the fence. I mean, I can see it going either way. And something you touch on your Substack article is this de-dollarization isn't all it's cracked up to be. And I think there is an exaggerated hype when it comes to BRICS and the multipolar world. That seems to be a longer term trend. But there's a lot of people saying the dollar is going to become toast and BRICS is going to take over. How do you sort of assess the state of the dollar as the dollar itself, as well as the dollar world reserve, this process of de-dollarization and so forth?
Well, first of all, I've made the claim over the last couple of years, particularly as the war with Ukraine started and people really started thinking the BRICS were going to take over, that they're not in terms of supplanting the dollar. And people thought last year that they were going to have this big confab, which they did have, at which they would start a new currency. And I said, no, I don't see that happening, not now. And they didn't. They've refused to even talk about it. Now, some people are saying it's going to happen again this year. I don't think so. Obviously, the desires and reasons for trying to overthrow the dollar grow the more we weaponize the dollar. And, the more we mismanage the dollar, the more the things the Federal Reserve does causes people in other countries who finance in the dollar to have huge problems because of the Federal Reserve and what it's doing with inflation to fight it. Obviously, all these things are going to create pressure against the dollar. But first of all, you've got to recognize there's two ways we talk about the value of the dollar. One is its purchasing power, basically inside the United States, where we're talking about inflation. And that's a whole different metric than when we talk about the foreign exchange value of the dollar, because the foreign exchange value of the dollar is a comparative value compared to another basket of currencies. How's the dollar doing? Well, compared to another basket of major currencies, the dollar is doing fantastic, right? The dollar is still strong, and it's gone up in the last couple of years. So it hasn't whittled down at all in terms of that value. It's got ups and downs. It always does. But generally speaking, it's been holding pretty strong overall. But its value in the United States is crashing. It's hurting people who live in the United States. And then as the Fed fights that hurts people who live in other countries who finance with the dollar and now have to pay back with higher interest rates and stuff like that. So the inflation problem is one set of problems with the value of the dollar. The international value of the dollar on the dollar exchange is a whole different matter. And what's interesting is, while it's hard to believe that the dollar isn't going to crumble internationally as the global reserve currency with all of this pressure, the dollar hasn't lost any use at all in the last 10 years. I just published a chart in that article you showed showing the use of the dollar has actually gone up over the last 10 years, not down. And a lot of people are saying, well, it's gone down because China's taken over, the use of the yuan has gone up and up. Well, it hasn't gone up very much. It's like 7% of the currency, that's in use. And where it has gone up, it's gone up because it's taken, because the euro's gone down. And so it's pulled market share away from the euro. And it's pulled market share away from other currencies that have, like the yen, that have had serious problems. And so that's where the yuan has, gained market share. It hasn't gained any market share against the dollar. The dollar has still held its position. So in that sense, the dollar has been holding pretty strong, even in spite of the war over the last couple of years that this war has been going on. The dollar has still held that position as king dollar. Now, I don't think you can, keep weaponizing it forever and not hurt yourself. But it's a long haul to bring the dollar down with that form of collapse. And China is nowhere near doing it. Look at how they've had to battle to support the yuan during the past year, where they've had all kinds of problems, and the yen has had massive problems. The euro's had, not too many years back, had its problems with, the various exits that were going on and being talked about. So all these currencies have their problems like the dollar does. And so I'm not anticipating a dollar collapse. What I am anticipating is a global economic collapse, in good part because of what the Fed's doing. And I think when that happens, I think that we may go for a new kind of currency by mutual agreement, where various nations come together, probably in the West, and say, we want a digital currency, and it takes that path. And whether that's the new dollar or the new some global currency or whatever, it won't be so much because the dollar crashes as that everything is crashing, and they look for a solution to everything with an everything kind of answer.
Yeah, that was my next question, and feel free to throw in any biblical insights or in terms of prophecy, because the digital dollar, there are people who are positing this is the issue with the debt, right? The debt bubble, right. And then if we go, and they're always looking for ways to kick the can down the road, and so if they create now this infinite virtual digital space, they can just then take that debt, or just move on into the virtual world with all this talk of tokenization and digital this and that, and then so we get into this space of interoperable central bank digital currencies, digital IDs, which would be necessary for all of this, and that brings us back to the idea of digital passports, and then in this space, this becomes total totalitarianism, right? Like one of my past podcast guest Edwin Black calls the algorithm ghetto. It's like a social credit basically system, and then we're completely screwed because if we're seeing this now in the UK, right, with Keir Jong-un or Keir Stalin arresting grannies for thought crime. So it's basically 40 years later. 1984 has now come true, where they're now.
That's what was on my mind as you're talking. Yeah,
right. They're criminalizing thought, and this is now across the Western world. Actually, in my latest for subscribers only weekly headlines and commentary, I pulled a quote from good old Tolkien. I'm trying to pull it up, where he says, quote, "Over the land there lies a long shadow, westward reaching wings of darkness." And so this is one of the things I talk about the most on the podcast, because I think it's the biggest threat, because it's in all nations. You can escape a war in Ukraine or Israel or whatever, but there's no nation that is not doing this. And some of us have experienced this during the past few years, where travel is restricted, work is restricted, your ability to buy food is restricted. And so, any thoughts on if you were to peer ahead, what the road might look like with these CBDCs and technocracy?
Oh yeah, my gosh! I mean, I'm just amazed at how fast the world has changed that way, and how rapidly with the COVID situation we crashed into 1984. I mean, I just feel like we jumped in with both feet, and it happened in months. It was a stunning change, and part of what's so stunning about it is to see how many citizens supported it. The peer pressure to come and do what you're being told to do, to inject experimental medicines into your body because you're told to do it. To not be able to go to church because you're told you can't, to not be able to gather in public, even though we supposedly have a freedom of assembly, because you're told you can't, and using the healthcare to do that. And it's just amazing how many people, became violent to make sure that happened. I mean, I saw a video, a guy was just sitting during the COVID thing when we were all supposed to mask up, and he was sitting on the sidewalk drinking his cup of coffee, and someone came along and smashed it out of his hands. And I think punched him, if I recall, and said, you don't have your mask on. Like, well, how do I drink coffee with my mask on? And I'm the only one sitting here on this bench. They got in a big fight. It's just lunatic to me that people are that willing to, that are that able to be just dragged along by the government and these things. And then in the end, we find out that it doesn't appear that masking did that much help, or that the vaccine was that much. I mean, I didn't get the vaccine, and I was fired for refusing to get the vaccine, and I was left unemployed for 2 years. That's when I started the dailydoom.com. I said, I got to do something different. I got to find some support. First, I started trying to write articles about COVID and about my experience with COVID, and I was censored. I had articles that were getting 500,000 readers on a couple of different websites, and then both of those websites, and they were some of their top 10 articles, told me stop writing on COVID. And I'm like, why? This is really popular, and it needs to be said. Well, we've been told by Google that, and we have seen that our website results have absolutely cratered. And we're going way down, and that's because Google's throttling the website because of these articles on COVID. So I was making $200 an article, and that's how I was helping support myself at the time when Biden got me fired. So I lost my livelihood. And I was writing about my experience and my thoughts on that. And and then another website did the same thing. And then I started getting emails from Google myself on my old website that I mentioned, where they said, we're not going to give you any advertising revenue on these articles. And I noticed they were all the articles about COVID because you're speaking outside of, what we believe is true. You're spreading false information. So, shut down left and right. But the idea that a president of the United States could not just try to pressure people to get an experimental vaccine, but that he could cut off their livelihood and possibly let them die then if they didn't. Because my wife, was working. She has a great paying job, and she kept working, and she got the vaccine because, she wouldn't take that risk regardless of not working. She's not that kind of a risk taker, and I totally respect that. And if she hadn't done that, I don't know where we'd be stuck anyway. But I wasn't going to. And so I lost my livelihood. Well, how long does it take? Most of us are living month to month practically. A lot of people are. We had some savings, but it wouldn't have taken too long if we both lost our jobs before we lose our house. And then we start losing other things. And then how do you eat? Where do you live? Biden didn't care. Neither did all the people that were, saying, yeah, you got to lose your job. Look at all the people like my employer that stepped in line and said, okay. And then, because I work for a tribal government, when the vaccines, when the vaccine mandate was finally eradicated by the Supreme Court that said, you can't do that, it's unconstitutional. Yeah, no kidding. But Constitution didn't matter. Then where I worked, well, they're a law unto themselves. So they just said, we're going to stay with the mandate. So I remained unemployed for quite a while until finally they decided to drop it. And then I went back to work for them. So I never thought we'd be in a world where the president of the United States could actually destroy my livelihood for a couple of years, and it could have been longer, except the Supreme Court cut him short. And that so many people would go along with that, just like you read about in 1984. And what a mass movement that was of people that went along with all of that. Well, then in the midst of that, you have Bill Gates, who was constantly pushing for these passports you're talking about and ID systems. And he not only wanted to just sort of generally tie them to whether or not you're vaccinated, but he actually patented a system where the vaccine is imprinted on essentially what's like a computer circuit print and stamped into your hand. As this print is stamped into your hand and little bits of copper are injected into your hand. And that becomes a scannable code that they can say, oh, this guy's vaccinated, because the only way you get that code in your hand is if you, get the vaccine. That's the only way it would be delivered. So he was, promoting things like this as a way to make sure that people are vaccinated, because then if you wanted to go into a ball game or do anything public, you couldn't, because you wouldn't pass the scanner. Well, it never, they didn't go quite that step yet, but they did go with the passports, the ID where I live. I'd live, not too far from Seattle, and so, the mayor there required it. The governor here required it for public events. You couldn't go into restaurants. You couldn't go to ball games, things like that, without having the passport. So now I'm treated like I'm in a ghetto, right, at that point in time, because I can't participate with the rest of society. I got to go over here. You might as well just put the band on my arm, because that's what you've done with the passport. I don't get to go with my wife to those things or with my family to those things. That's the insanity we leaped into. And tell me that isn't 1984, And then you look at that Stampy one, and you brought up, Bible prophecy, and you think of the prophecy about, the digital number 666. Well, that's digital, whether it's computer digital or what, it is digit 666. I think that it probably refers to something like what Bill Gates invented there, what he patented, a system by which you can have your hand scanned. And now, just like they cut off your livelihood, if you don't participate, maybe they'll cut off your finances too. They had no hesitation in cutting off my livelihood. That's not a whole lot better than less than cutting off my finances, though obviously your finances means even money in the bank isn't going to save you. Even, anyway, it's just unbelievable. And would they take that step? Well, look how far they went. And all it took was a disease scare in order to get everybody to get in line. And oh my gosh, they're so terrified of this disease that's coming, which turned out to be not that bad. Ironically, the reason I did not get the vaccine was I had already had COVID before the mandate came out, and I got over it in 2 weeks. And I said, well, now I've got better immunity than I would from a vaccine, because that's all a vaccine does, is triggers your natural immunity. It doesn't give you any immunity. There's no immunity in a vaccine. It just makes your body respond and create its own immunity. Well, which is going to be stronger? It's a no-brainer to say if your body has to fight one little spike protein and figure out how to do that, that's going to be a weaker response than if it has to figure out how to fight the whole living disease and come up with many responses to do that over a disease that's actively attacking it. So, of course, that's stronger immunity. And what I've seen is that the people, a lot of the people that we know that got the vaccine have had COVID 2 or 3 times. I never got it after that, and I didn't get the vaccine. And I live in a town where very few people practice social distancing or masks. It's a very conservative farm town. And I didn't get COVID again. So how important was the vaccine when people that are having the vaccine have to keep getting it and still keep getting COVID?
Yeah, I think there's a clear trend if we go back again to the 1940s and the Nazi regime backed by IBM and big pharma cartel, IG Farben and whatnot. There were a lot of Anglo-American backers of the occult Nazi regime, and they were using IBM was for them creating this sort of prototype of what we experienced. So there's, and I think I agree with you. If we go back then, they were working on it, they attempted it, and then over the decades, they've just been upgrading and improving upon it. We went through it, and then I think, as you say, they're just going to keep improving this sort of system. And I'm also of the view that it doesn't necessarily, and I've seen what you've talked about. I've looked at those patents of Bill Gates and others, and I can see it going in any which direction where they wouldn't even need to implant anything, because now you're having the facial recognition or the palm payments. And so you could just, now shops could be cashless and you pay with your face or your palm. But as you say, if you are if you are a thought criminal, if you're not down with what the regime or system says, and that can be related to Christian values or other values, your palm scan or your face scan will be denied, and you won't be able to carry out your public or private transaction, whether it's to buy food or renew your driver's license or get your passport or whatever, even to register to pay your taxes. That would mean that you are not complying with tax report.
You're a criminal.
Yeah, and so, but you can't, because the
forced
system,
to be a criminal.
Right, you're forced to be that.
It's a catch-22 that they can put on you. And, there may have been a time when we thought, well, that kind of totalitarianism that's so far from the United States or other countries that we live in, that isn't going to happen, because, the citizens would just go wild if it did. Well, look how far they got in COVID, how much did happen. It's not that big of a step anymore if they got, all that we just talked about, them shutting down, to just say, okay, well, we're going to shut down your finances too. And it's the CBDC that makes that possible, right? The central bank digital currency. As more and more nations are going towards that, then you get into money that can be shut down. Cash can't be shut down, other than shutting it down for everyone, but it can't be selectively shut down. If you got some, you can spend it. How do they know you got the right cash or the wrong cash, But if you have a CBDC, one of the things people talked about is it can be electronically shut down. It's just an account. And so now you've got a real move towards totalitarianism. And if they would go as far as they did with COVID, why would we think they wouldn't go as far or farther with just as much ease?
And just since we're discussing this right now, usually towards the end, I ask, what do we do? And I'm of the view that this is just going to progressively keep getting worse, and then we'll find ourselves again in such a situation, and next time it's only going to be worse. Again, my faith and hope is in the world beyond, in Jesus. But meanwhile, I think like the basic thing one can do is at least try to create systems where you're less dependent on the system, and that's creating have a friends and family, a network of people, but also maybe having a piece of land outside the system, which would allow you to feed yourself and remain independent. Any thoughts on like how to survive, a next iteration of COVID 1984?
Yeah, well, that would be very hard to do because I mean, I'm for that. But even if you have your land, how do you buy the stuff you need to work your land, right? Because you're cut out of the system. But if you have your land, you have stuff. Yeah, there's probably some things you can do, right? If you got some seeds, you grow your own seed stocks. So you don't have to buy seeds. Do organic fertilizer, so you don't have to buy fertilizer. Things like that. You can help yourself that way. But not everybody has the strength, the physical capacity to do that, or knows anything about farming to do it, or has the money to buy a farm. We had a farm. We sold it. I thought having it was a great idea for exactly such times as you're talking about. But when we sold it, we made certain we sold it to someone who intended to farm it long term, and that we built good relations with them. Gave them special discounts on the tractors and equipment to help them get started. And, so we were invited to their wedding, which was on the farm and stuff. I'm just saying, those relationships are what's important. So I think that if we ever got into such a dire situation, they've got more land than they need for their growing. We could go back to them and say, hey, can we have a little plot here, and do something with it? And they do grow their own seed stock. They are organic farmers, and, they're doing a good job with it. So I think that was an okay move because we still kept that avenue open. But for a lot of people, that's harder to do. And I do agree with you. It's going to keep progressing in this direction. So, you look at the biblical prophecies you mentioned, it's not just that there's going to be, some sort of currency you have to have, but that you can't buy and sell like we're talking about. You're cut out if you don't get the mark, whatever it is. And how far away are we from that? It could be next year at the rate we've progressed now. It wouldn't take that long to happen because we've already got countries that have adopted CBDCs. And it's just a matter of getting everybody comfortable enough with it to get all the sheep in the pen. And then once you do, then you close the gate. So, it may take a little bit of time to develop, but it's not going to be that much. And we can see it starting to develop very soon in the United States, Mexico, wherever. And it already is in some countries. So I think it's going unstoppably down that path. But personally, it's stoppable, right? Because what the Bible says in those passages is anybody who receives that mark, you're, toast. You're not going to make it to heaven. You're not going to have the afterlife you'd like to have. You're going to go to the lake of fire, all that kind of stuff. So it's that important that you don't become a part of the system. And, you look at AI and where that's going and the stuff that Musk is doing with brain implants. And you think, how far is it before we become like the Borg in Star Trek, where you're like this sort of quasi-human, this human being that's added so many chips that you're like half computer, half robot. We might not be, that far away from that happening because there's already people getting those implants who can control electronic devices with just their mind. And so it's not hard to see then the level of control that can be had and how deep this digitization might go into the human being. And then you've got, two classes of people, those who are digitized and those who refuse. And there'll be a lot who refuse. But in those biblical prophecies, it says they'll be killed too. That the world's not going to put up with them refusing. And how hard is that to see when we see people getting punched for drinking a cup of coffee without a mask on?
Yeah, and what you said about people taking the mark, I view this as something that's been with us in different ways throughout history, and more of someone who capitulates to the point where you accept whatever needs to be accepted for participating in the system, but that could mean ultimately rejecting God or Jesus, and that's a point where you've just rejected Christ for a piece of bread, right. And then you're kind of screwed.
And that's where I was meant to go with that, and right. I kind of lost my way just a little bit. is that, you talked about how unstoppable is. I was going to say I don't believe it's stoppable on the macro level, but it is stoppable by you on your own level. But that doesn't mean the price to pay won't be severe. And so I think it becomes a question then, and I haven't resolved this for myself, is how far along that road do you go before you say, I stop and I get cut out? I said I stopped with the vaccine. I had the comfort of doing that because we still had income coming in, and we had a decent amount of savings that we could live off of as well during that time. But how far do you go before you just say, I'm not going to participate because now I think we're at that level the Bible's talking about? Do you go right up to it and hope you don't step over the line? Or do you just say, you know what, I'm not even going to go down that path at all. As soon as things go digital, I'm not going there. Then you got a long, tough road to hoe of where are you going to do? What are you going to do? And we're going to need a society of friends, people with understanding who can help each other out, because it's going to take some teamwork to negotiate through that, to navigate it.
Yeah, and what you said earlier is interesting. I mean, it's fascinating to have someone like yourself I have guests on who live on farms already, listeners as well, and the fact that you had a farm and you gave it up. But I think that's also another viable option or alternative, whereas, I don't have land in my name, rural land, but I know plenty of people that do. And, when it gets to that situation, it does become a numbers game. And so if you're one of those people that has a farm and things are getting bad, you're going to want to have more people that you can trust on your land to add to your numbers for, security reasons, to grow further food. And so, I'm also leaning on, and, if you go back historically, that's also a Christian thing where Christians banded together, many in the New Testament examples of, selling land, using that to help the community. And so I'm investing myself more in that sense in my local social network and I'm pretty sure some of the folks I know, if things get that bad, they're going to be like, hey, come on the land. I know people right now, they're building their homes, brick by brick on the weekends. And so it's just, I think that's also very equally as good a solution, apart from buying your own property, is, I could go help my friend build his home, farm the land, as exchange for letting me live there and that sort of stuff. And so that's why I always say it's important to invest in the network. One of the top things to do. Just I do want to get to your piece, a fantastic piece that's free to read, Thundering Toward Armageddon, on your Substack. I thought it was excellent. I've been sharing it this morning. But before getting there, any quick thought, since you're in the U.S., on what's happening there? Today Trump is he's back on Twitter today for the first time in years. He's doing a chat with Elon Musk, and there's talk of Biden's gone, Kamala Harris now. There's talk of second civil war, all sorts of madness. Just any thought on what's important for you domestically in the U.S. when it comes to politics, elections, and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big thing because, I mentioned my predictions on inflation and how unemployment was going to trick the Fed and not give it the reading it needed to get out in time, and the development of a recession, and that it would be a stealth recession. And now there are others coming along saying that's what it is. It's not showing up in GDP, but it's there. I think that one of the other big things I'd said is that this is going to be, I'm calling it the year of chaos. And, in big part because of these elections, right? And we saw what happened last time and how chaotic that turned out. And we're in a year this year where it doesn't make any difference which side is going to lose. It's going to be chaos. If Trump supporters lose, Trump's already preparing the way to say that it's because the election was rigged. I guarantee you, if he wins, he won't say it's rigged. But I guarantee you that if he doesn't win, he will say it's rigged. Is the election going to be run differently whether he wins or not? I don't think so. It's going to be run how it's going to be run. So the same thing is going to be true. If Kamala doesn't win and Trump gets in, the leftards are going to go insane. They're just going to go insane that they got another 4 years of Trump, and who knows how violent that will be. But Trump's own people have shown themselves sometimes willing to be violent too. So I think that violence is going to reach a head. With civil war, well, it's certainly a possibility, given that you've got everybody, not everybody, but you got lots of people talking about it as if it's something that's either inevitably going to happen or that it should happen. If my side loses, then yeah, bring on civil war. I don't think they realize the cost of what they're talking about. We're going to talk in a bit about Israel, and you can see the same kinds of things there, where there are people who are hell bent on war for different reasons, and they're not really thinking about how intensely that's going to cost them. If there is anything like, it's not going to be a civil war, I don't think, like there was with the South against the North, but maybe more like a lot of social unrest, like we saw in the Lyndon Johnson era, and maybe worse. But it's going to be like spots here and there, things being put down by whichever government's in charge. I just don't think people realize how much they could get hurt, how it could be their grandkids are carrying dead in their arms. The cost of this thing is horrendous.
And then to move to the global war scenario, and in your latest article, and I'd agree with you, you say what I want to call to attention is not on how Israel chooses to defend itself, but what it has to say about small groups of Jewish zealots who strive to bring this war on in order to force the timing of the Messiah's arrival onto their schedule. And so, again, you say naturally many in Israel do not want war, but then some in Israel do want war. And that's a strong point, because there are listeners who believe the Jews run everything. I don't believe that, but there is a faction. There's different factions, and I reported in my weekly news yesterday that I published. There was a mainstream article talking about how, again, there's this group of zealots bringing out the red heifer, preparing for the third construction of the Temple Mount. My Christian worldview is like, I think that's slated to happen. I'm not behind that. I don't want that to happen, because that happening is actually, that's about bringing back, because they want to set up this Temple Mount to bring this political Messiah in who would be actually Antichrist figure. So, from a Christian view, it's not like, well, I don't want to Antichrist.
I think that is huge. And it's interesting for me to hear you say that, because I don't hear too many people say it. In fact, there's Christians who will support that. So, you've got this group there's several groups, I think, that are kind of working there, but one group called the Temple Mount Faithful. And, I think they're the group that are trying to get the red heifer so they can sacrifice it and get sacrifices started on this Temple Mount again. So they go there at Passover and they sacrifice a lamb and they do stuff like that. They try to make a run up the hill with these big giant blocks they've cut out for cornerstones for the temple, and Israel tries to stop them and does stop them. These groups, there are Christians who want to support that because they think, well, this is the end times coming and we want to help get it there. The prophecies that I wrote about in the article that came out today, the thing that I note is that they say, woe to those who say, let the day of the Lord come quickly that we may see it. That day will be darkness, not light. Why do you say, let the day of the Lord come quickly that we may see it? And there's a few different prophecies that say that basically same thing. And it comes right down to the point you're saying, is that while these things are going to happen, I think that what the prophets are saying is, don't you be the one who participates in them. Don't you be the one who finances them. Don't be, one of the biblical prophecies is that they will try to take the times of the end into their own hands. Don't be one of the people who tries to take the timing of end time events into your own hand, because when you do that, you become a part of the evil. And the interesting part of your comment there was, to me, I don't hear too many people talking about that this temple is evil, but it is evil. It is sacrilegious. It ties right back to the same prophecies. It's evil in this sense. And it's not intended to do evil things to people. It's intended to let Judaism flourish as it once did. But Jesus, when he gave these prophecies about the end times, said that the temple would be destroyed right after he condemned the Pharisees for basically keeping the Jewish people from seeing the truth. And he walked out of the temple and he told his disciples, this temple will be destroyed and not one stone will be left upon another. And he said to the Pharisees, and you won't see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Well, now you've got all these Jewish people doing things because they believe if they start this war or they take this action to build this temple, that then the Messiah will come. And you've got Christians who are saying, well, if we help fund them so they can build the temple, then the Messiah will come sooner. But Jesus said that temple would be destroyed. Why? Because he was the ultimate sacrifice that was made when they crucified it, and Romans and Jews both. And so we all have a hand in it. No one side to be blamed over another. And that was to end sacrifice. And we saw that become the end times when it happened of the Old Testament. That's why we call it the Old Testament. It's a huge volume of history, and it contains a whole time period in which Judaism was practiced in a certain way. And with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, 40 years later, that was gone. 40 years being a pretty memorable number to Jews, because you can go right back to where it all started with wandering in the wilderness, where they had to wait 40 years to come into the land. 40 years after Jesus was killed, they were kicked out of the land. Very meaningful symmetry there. And so that's when the diaspora happened. That's when the temple was destroyed. Jesus said, you won't see me again here. I think he meant on the Temple Mount, until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. In other words, until you recognize that I am your Messiah. And until then, I'm not going to be back here. So trying to rebuild that temple, what you're really trying to do is build a pathway to get the old religion back. It's a deliberate affront to Jesus Christ. It's a deliberate effort to refuse to accept him as Messiah, so that the temple builders of today can reject that cornerstone and have their old religion back. Well, if God had wanted the old religion to stay around the way it was, don't you think it would have? It's been gone for 2,000 years in the form in which it was practiced. That's a pretty strong judgment by God. Something like that doesn't happen if God doesn't intend for it to happen. You don't get a whole end of the Old Testament as it was practiced without that being in God's plan. So you have to wake up to that and say, well, then we're going to try to what? Bring this back on our own? Is that what God wants? And why would we as Christians participate in that? It's a refusal of Jesus Christ in order to take back sacrifices of lambs and red heifers and go back to the old way of doing it. So it's incredibly sacrilegious. And as you say, it would certainly sound from biblical prophecies that the Antichrist will set himself up in connection with that temple. So, yeah, people are trying to do it. And with the types of wars we see in the land, what we see now is groups of people in Israel that are saying, let's fight this war. Let's bring it on. Bring it on, Iran. Because when, from the Jewish perspective, within those narrow, very, very far right groups, I guess you could call them, there's a desire to make the end happen quickly, to bring it on, to make the Messiah return. If we build the temple for him, then he'll come back. If that starts a war, he'll come back to win the war for us, so we'll be okay. And, the prophecies say, woe to you, because that day will be darkness and not light. And then they describe a whole lot of horrible things that happen. And that's what will happen to the people who involve themselves in bringing on the end that way. It's going to be terrible. It's not going to be good.
And I pretty much agree with everything you laid out here. And I've always viewed these types of things as from an observer's perspective. That's why I don't have much to say when it comes to the whole Israel, Gaza, Palestine. Like, I don't want to put my flag down on either position. I'm like, this is like beyond me now, as you're sort of laying out. These are supernatural events, and I'm just like, I like what one of my past guests called me, who's also a Christian German scientist. He said, I'm a chronicler. And someone today was saying, like, that I just whine on my podcast. I'm like, I'm not here to provide solutions. I always created this podcast as a way to just figure out what's happening in the world. So I'm chronicling what's happening. Don't come to me for solutions. But so yeah, I just and definitely what you say is a contrast to people who actively participate in some of these things. That's actually, they're going to get wrath, I guess, on them or something of the sort. And this synchronizes as well, because you've got a group in Iran, right, who also right? A zealous group who want to bring this about because that'll bring about their Mahdi. And then I recently talked about on the podcast the New Age. You've also got this New Age theosophical Gnostic faction that is also discussing, like Lucis Trust, talking about how the Antichrist figure is here right now, and he's waiting to be unveiled. So you've got the New Age faction, you've got the Jewish zealot faction combined with the Christian Zionists, and then you've got the Iranian and other parts of the Islamic world faction. And again, I don't think, for me, this is not mean throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The truth of the Old and New Testament of Jesus, people will take this and throw everything out and say, the God of Yahweh is Satan and Jesus is false. And no, we have to be very careful. And so, thoughts then on the road ahead. I'm expecting at some point. I don't know where that is. I don't think it's necessarily in the near term. Like, we're all waiting for Iran to retaliate and nothing ever happens. And I think a lot of pieces are not ready yet on the global grand chessboard, to borrow from Zbigniew Brzezinski. But I think at some point in the coming years, perhaps we're going to see some global conflagration. And so, thoughts on the road ahead.
Yeah, first of all, just in light of what you said about where you don't take a stake in the ground about what's happening with Palestine and Gaza, I want to be careful to be clear there too. That what I said with respect to those who want war, I'm not saying that all of Israel wants war, and I'm certainly not saying they don't have a right to defend themselves. How they choose to do that is their business. They're the ones that are being threatened, and the rest of us can sit back and judge whether or not we think they're doing it the right way, the wrong way. I'm not saying anything about that. I'm just saying, like I think you were saying, is that there's a group of people that want war. They want to bring on the end because they believe it's going to, bring back the old religion and their version of the Messiah. And those people are the ones who create the situation, I believe, that we see talked about in end time prophecies. And that's why it says woe to them, is their desire to bring on the big end becomes a causal factor in all of this, that drive and that zealotry. And whether that happens in, some people have said that, and I write about that in my article, that Iran was planning to do this attack tonight or tomorrow, because tonight starts Tisha B'Av in Judaism, the which is where they look at the commemorate. Let's say, I don't want to say celebrate. They commemorate the evil events that were done to Israel, the horrible things that were done to Israel, and that Iran wants to pick that date to launch its big attack. Was that going to be the war to end all wars? Well, that's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying that it could certainly be a major escalation thing that starts things moving at a much faster pace towards that kind of event. If it were to happen, it doesn't matter if it happens tonight or not, or tomorrow, when because the Jewish day spans sunset to sunset, right? So it starts today at sunset and continues on to the next sunset. Anyway, it's not that it matters what day it is, but it just shows you that there's a lot of intensity there, and people on both sides, that are kind of itching towards war, as well as wiser people that don't want it, and it can blow up fast. So we don't really know if it's going to happen right away or the pieces are in place. This could be the thing that starts putting the pieces in place, right? It could be the thing where the course of the road takes a big turn, and then all of a sudden we're steaming down this track that's where the bridge is washed out.
I was in my for members only post on my Substack yesterday. I was basically closing saying it's a slow burn to Armageddon. Nothing happens until it does. Keep calm and carry on. And I even thought about when I posted that, when I signed off yesterday, and we're talking about COVID. I actually thought, think about that. During World War II, they were telling Britons to keep calm and carry on, and that should have been the response for the COVID. You should have just keep calm and carry on, and life would have been normal. But why couldn't we have kept calm and carried on during COVID? But any other thoughts? Final thoughts? It's interesting that you said you gave up your farm. Is it good to have? We didn't get we didn't get into gold and silver, but I always say, it's good to have 10, 20%, a little bit in gold and silver. Bitcoin, I'm not a big Bitcoiner. I think Bitcoin is part of the ruse for the CBDCs, but any other thoughts for us, final thoughts, whether it's ways you think people, some things, wise things, people, actions that they can take, or anything else?
Well, like with our giving up the farm, that was something that didn't really go quite as we intended. We were trying to get ready for retirement, right? And we thought, okay, if we can sell the farm right at that time where property prices were, it looked like they had peaked out, and that we'd be able to sell the farm, and we'd be able to buy a much smaller farm, because this was a 40-acre farm with large outbuildings, and we thought we don't need that just to grow our own food. Find a 2 or 3 acre farm nestled up against the mountains, and we'll wind up being mortgage free. COVID hit right while the sale was going on, and all of a sudden the prices went astronomical, and the people we sold it to were getting a farm loan, FHA approved, and it was on a special program, so it had to go through a whole big process that took months. And so from the time we sold the home, when it would have been a great time to sell, everything went crazy with housing prices going higher than the price we'd sold at rapidly, and with no inventory on the market. So we come out of it, when we finally do have money, there's nothing there that we want to buy. Wherever we look and say, we went after house after house, we're like, do we want this? No. So it kind of all blew up. Eventually we found a home that we like in a farm town, and we did maintain good relations with the people we sold it to. So I think we've maintained an avenue there. But our real goal was just to have a smaller farm where we can still grow things for ourselves and for other people, but just not have a mortgage anymore, because not having a mortgage was a part of being prepared. So if you can pull the not have a mortgage thing, that's a great thing to do, but that's harder now than ever. So I don't know what people are going to do there. People are kind of the property market's locked up because of the prices and the interest rates, and that seems to be taking a while for that ice dam to break. Holding gold, it's hard to transact in gold. It's a good asset to have, but the idea that you can go out and buy and sell with it, it's going to be real hard when you don't have any access to cash in your gold. And it's going to be hard to find people that will trade with you for gold, because they don't trust your gold, right? It's like, how do I know it's as pure as you say? How do I know? And what do I have to do when I go to buy and sell with it? I don't want to do that. I just want my CBDC for my radishes I got to sell, because I'm not where you are. I don't care about the things you're concerned about with this thing. So you're still going to be kind of locked out of the system. It gives you something you can trade with those that aren't a part of that system, but there's other things you can trade, like you say, like your work and stuff. And the relationships to me are the main thing. So nothing against gold. I've been, saying on other places where my articles are carried that, gold seems to be a good asset to be in right now. But what you really need is relationships. You need something that how ways you can help others, but we should never just live unto ourselves, right? So we got to think in terms of, okay, what do I have to give? That's where the farm's a nice idea. My thought was we'd get other people to help farm the land, just like you're talking about, and sort of caboose it. And it's like, you guys are going to do the work, and you're going to pay us 10% in vegetables, and you keep 90%. But if I got 10 of you, then that's enough for me to have my vegetables too. That kind of a thing. I mean, you think you get creative about it, right? So having land certainly is a good thing.
Yeah, that's sound advice as well with the gold and silver. Alternative media, again, sometimes hypes it up, and I think it's not going to be as some in alternative media for decades have been saying, in the parallel system, we're just going to gold and silver, and no, we're going to have the problem as just as you outlined. I mean, I've run that thought experiment even here in Mexico, and if things break, I've got some gold and silver, and it's like you'll probably find some use for it, some farmer or rancher or whatever who will exchange it for meat or whatever. But it's not going to be like, every farmer or rancher you come across is going to be like, yeah, you're going to run into the same issue. So it's good to have some, but it's not going to be, I think, as wonderful as we all imagine it. And I fully agree with you. The social aspect, the relationships are the most important. And David, we've covered a lot. I love this conversation. If you want to tell us again Your links are in the description, but where people can best find you, your project services that you offer, how they can become part of Daily Doom.
Yeah, I write regularly about all this stuff on thedailydoom.com, and that's the best place to find me. You don't have to be a paying subscriber in order to read most of what's there. I try to give away as much as I can, but I certainly, like anybody, need support to keep at it as well. So there's the opportunity for that. And I try to give a little bit more to those that are willing to be a part of actually helping make it happen, and not, be just takers, but givers also. So that's where my thoughts all get published, and then they go out to other sites from there.
All right. I look forward to a future chat, and then seeing you on the other side of eternity. Thanks for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
All right. Nice talking with you, Hervoya.